The night is quiet, too quiet for what has just happened. The air hangs heavy with smoke and memory, the ground scattered with pieces of iron that once held men in place. Chains lie open, their weightless silence louder than any scream. In the dim light of a dying fire, the remnants of a cabin breathe like something alive. The world outside is still, the insects have gone silent, and even the wind seems to pause, afraid to disturb what has been set in motion. Somewhere in that darkness stands a man. His chest rises and falls, each breath rough, deliberate, the sound of someone learning how to exist again. For years, his life was not his own. His labor, his body, his family, all claimed by another man's name. But tonight something has broken. What they took from him cannot be taken anymore. He has reached the end of what any human can bear. For generations, men like him were born into chains, and told that this was the order of the world. The plantation was the world, and within it, he was nothing more than a number, a pair of hands, a shadow under the southern sun. The masters called it civilization, the preachers called it divine order, and the law called it property. Every day he worked beneath a sky that did not care, from dawn until the stars reappeared, while the earth drank his sweat and pain. The plantation itself was a perfect machine. Every movement measured, every rule designed to remind the enslaved of their place. The White House on the hill stood like a monument to cruelty disguised as elegance, its columns smooth, its halls echoing with the laughter of the powerful. To the outside world, it was refinement, beauty, order. Inside, it was a cage, a stage where the master's temper and whims decided the fate of those who had no defense but endurance. He had once believed he could endure anything, that submission might at least keep his family safe. That belief was the last thing that connected him to hope. His wife's hands, his child's laughter, the few quiet moments at dusk when he could pretend that life might be something more than survival. That fragile illusion was the only freedom he had, and like all things given to the enslaved, it could be taken at any time. And it was. One day, as the sun hung low and red above the fields, everything was taken. The plantation owner had made a decision, casual as breathing, to sell his wife to another estate. No reason given, no warning, just a piece of paper, a transaction sealed with ink. He was ordered to keep working, ordered not to speak, not to beg, not to break formation. He watched the cart roll away with her inside, her hands reaching out until the dust hid her from sight. Something inside him changed that day. Grief became something sharper, something cold and deliberate. For nights, he said nothing. He worked. He ate what little they gave. He waited. But his silence was no longer submission, it was study. He began to notice every movement, every pattern of the overseer, every moment when the night guards grew careless, every sound of the locks, every creak of the wood that might one day open the way to something other than survival. He had no plan for escape. He no longer believed in escape. What he believed in was justice. Not the kind spoken in sermons, but the kind that came when a man took back what was stolen, even if it cost him his life. In the stillness of night, surrounded by other men too afraid to speak of hope, he found himself staring into the darkness, imagining what it would feel like to be feared instead of pitied. The plantation taught him everything he needed to know about cruelty. He learned how it hid behind civility, how it justified itself through prayer, how it smiled while it destroyed. He learned that the master's greatest weapon was not the whip, but the idea that resistance was useless. And yet, even in the deepest despair, a single ember of defiance remained. He had carried it for years without knowing. Now it had found its flame. He began to move differently. The others noticed it first, the steadiness in his eyes, the quiet precision of his steps. There was no anger left in him, only purpose. He no longer spoke when spoken to, no longer bowed his head when the overseer passed. Something about him made even cruelty hesitate. There are moments in history when silence becomes more dangerous than rage, and he had reached that moment. The days bled into each other. Cotton, sun, dust, blood. The endless rhythm of a world built on human suffering. He watched as others were beaten, watched as a child collapsed from exhaustion, watched as the overseer laughed. He felt no tears anymore. He had already buried the part of himself that could feel helplessness. What remained was a promise he whispered only once. They would never do this to anyone again. When night came, he looked at the stars, the same stars his ancestors once saw before they were stolen from their land. He wondered if they could still see him now, if they knew what had become of their sons and daughters. He wondered if they would understand what he was about to do. The wind moved through the trees like breath through a prayer. Somewhere far away, a whip cracked and a dog barked. He did not move yet, not that night nor the next. Vengeance was not a storm that arrived suddenly. It was a seed that grew in silence. Every injustice fed it. Every scream watered it. Every humiliation made it stronger. By the time anyone realized what he had become, it would already be too late. They had taken everything from him, his freedom, his love, his name. But they had also given him something without meaning to, the truth. He now understood that there was no peace in submission, no safety in silence. The system would devour him no matter how obedient he was. The only thing left was to decide how he would die, and whether his death would matter. He chose to make it matter. In the fields, under the watch of men who believed themselves gods, he began to plan his defiance. He hid his resolve in the rhythm of his labor, his strength disguised as exhaustion. He listened to whispers of rebellion, half-remembered tales of men like Nat Turner who had risen and been crushed but never forgotten. The stories of Gabriel Prosser, Denmark Vesey, names spoken like forbidden prayers. He did not know if he would live to see another sunrise. But for the first time, the fear of death no longer controlled him. Death was freedom, and if freedom could not be lived, it could still be claimed. The night before he acted, the world was silent again. The same stillness that comes before every storm. The same silence that has followed centuries of injustice, waiting for someone brave enough to shatter it. He sat in the dirt beside the broken fence, the moonlight pale on his hands. He thought of his wife's face, her laughter, the promise they once made to each other, to survive, to hold on. He could not keep that promise, but he could keep another, to make sure their suffering meant something. He closed his eyes, and for a brief moment, there was peace. Not the peace of obedience, but the peace of knowing that whatever happened next would no longer be in their control. It would be his. And when morning came, he would not bow his head again. The storm came without warning. The morning sky was the color of ash, the air heavy with the kind of silence that means something is about to break. The plantation still moved like a machine, unaware that one of its gears had decided to turn against it. The overseer's boots struck the ground in rhythm, his voice slicing through the air as he barked orders. But beneath the surface of that routine, something ancient had awakened, a man's will to reclaim himself. He worked that morning like every other, his hands steady, his back bent under the weight of the crop. But inside, every heartbeat counted down to the moment when fear would end. For years, he had been told that resistance was suicide, that rebellion meant death. And yet, there comes a time when living under a lie feels worse than dying for the truth. As the sun rose higher, the air shimmered with heat. Sweat rolled down his face, the soil burned his palms, but his thoughts were far away. Back to his wife's eyes the last time he saw her, the way her voice broke when she realized there would be no mercy, the way she reached for him as the cart rolled away. That memory was not pain anymore. It was fuel. He had hidden a piece of iron under the edge of the barn, disguised beneath straw and dust. It was dull but solid. A tool, not a weapon, until now. He had no army, no allies, no plan beyond what the night would reveal. What he had was purpose, and in a world built on control, purpose was the most dangerous weapon of all. The day stretched long, each hour another layer of disguise. He moved with the same rhythm, obeyed the same orders, spoke when spoken to. The master watched from his porch, sipping his drink, oblivious. The air was too calm, the way it feels before thunder cracks the sky open. And as the sun began to fall behind the trees, that calm finally shattered. No one remembers exactly how it began. Some said it started with a scream, others said it started with silence. But when it happened, it was swift, precise, inevitable. The overseer turned, perhaps to shout, perhaps to strike. And then there was nothing but motion, chaos, the sound of something ending that should never have begun. The plantation erupted, not in words but in action, the kind of action that comes when centuries of pain find their breaking point. The dogs howled. The wind carried voices that no one could understand. It was over as quickly as it began, but the air stayed thick with the truth of it. A man who had been born to obey had chosen defiance. He did not run. He did not hide. He stood where he had been enslaved and looked at the flames rising in the distance. For the first time, he saw the plantation not as a prison, but as a graveyard for the lie of white supremacy. When the others found him, they did not speak. Some were terrified, some frozen between awe and disbelief. He did not try to explain himself. What he had done could not be explained, it could only be felt. It was not madness, it was not vengeance for its own sake. It was truth made visible, justice made real for a single heartbeat in a world that denied both. The retaliation was brutal. The men came on horseback, armed, furious, their faces twisted with fear disguised as righteousness. The law was always ready to protect the system, to restore the illusion of control. They caught him before dawn. There was no trial, no question, no mercy. But when they brought him before the master, something in the room had shifted. The master, once a god in his own eyes, looked smaller, older, terrified. Power had been touched by mortality, and it would never feel safe again. They wanted to make an example of him, to remind the others what happens when a man forgets his place. But even as they punished him, even as they broke his body, they could not touch what had already been freed. His eyes did not lower. His silence mocked them. The more they beat him, the more his defiance grew. They thought they were erasing him. They were immortalizing him. When it was done, the plantation was quiet again. The ashes settled. The fields returned to motion. The machine restarted. But something invisible had changed. The enslaved walked slower, heavier, carrying the story of what had happened like a secret fire. They whispered his name when no one was listening. They spoke of him in the dark, when the moon was high and the guards were asleep. He became more than a man. He became a warning and a promise. Years later, even after his body had returned to the earth, his name lingered like smoke. Children who had never seen his face grew up hearing the story of the one who fought back. The masters feared those stories because they reminded everyone that control is never absolute. You can chain a body, but you cannot chain the idea of freedom once it's been spoken in blood. For the enslaved, his act was not just revenge, it was a kind of resurrection. Proof that even in the darkest corner of human cruelty, the human spirit could still rise. The plantation that once felt eternal now carried the memory of his defiance like a curse. Every creak of the wood, every shadow after sunset, reminded the living that power built on pain will one day answer to it. He did not live to see freedom, but freedom carried his name. His act was passed through whispers, through songs, through stories told in code. And when freedom finally came, decades later, the people remembered him, not as a monster, but as a man who showed them what courage looked like when the world had stolen everything else. The white historians erased his name. They called him savage, criminal, lost. But his people called him something different, righteous. They said he had done what every enslaved soul dreamed of doing, but only one dared. And in that dream, in that defiance, the first true seed of liberation was planted. Every rebellion, every act of resistance that came after carried a piece of him. He had turned his suffering into power, his grief into history. The fields that once drank the sweat of the enslaved now held their legacy. His fire did not die, it traveled. It moved through generations, through movements, through every voice that refused to be silenced. The plantation masters wanted order, control, obedience. But what they got was something they could never destroy: memory. The kind of memory that burns quietly through time until one day it becomes revolution. He had given them fear, and fear, once planted in the heart of oppression, never stops growing. Even now, when the land is quiet and the old houses crumble, his presence lingers in the soil. The wind still carries whispers through the broken fields, whispers that sound like his breath. The story they tried to bury keeps rising, stronger each time it's told, because he did not die in vain. He died to remind the world that even in chains, a man's spirit can burn brighter than the sun.